Scorpio, my dear, there are stories that come to me like whispers from another realm. Stories that press against my heart with a weight so profound I cannot keep them to myself. And today I bring you one of those stories. It is not simply a tale about fate or coincidence, but a living testament to how the unseen forces that guide us will sometimes step in with a precision so exact, so unyielding, that the world as you know it can shift overnight. I have kept many secrets in my work, but this is one I must share with you now, because the signs are telling me that it is meant for someone listening in this very moment. Only a few days ago, a woman came to me, a Scorpio, like you, carrying the heaviness of battles that had worn her down to the bone. She did not sit before me as a victim, but as someone on the edge of surrender, someone who had fought so long she could no longer tell the difference between holding on and letting go. Her eyes told me what her voice could not. They spoke of betrayals that had cut so deep she no longer knew where the wound ended and where she began. Around her were three figures, not strangers, but people from within her inner circle, each of them weaving threads of harm into her life. Each of them thinking she would never rise above it. You, Scorpio, understand the sting of betrayal better than anyone. You know the ache of being wounded by those you have let closest, the ones you believed would guard your heart. And when you are attacked in such a way, the instinct to fight back with everything you have is almost irresistible. But what unfolded for her, and what I suspect may soon unfold for you, was not the war she expected to wage. Instead, the universe had already begun crafting an intervention so exact and so unshakable that all she needed to do was hold her ground and allow the deeper currents to work in her favor. This is the story of how a Scorpio, broken and cornered, became the living embodiment of divine justice. And if you have found yourself here, reading these words, it is not by accident. The same current that swept her into transformation may be gathering its strength for you now, preparing to remove from your path every shadow that dares to stand in your light. Her name was Isolde, and though she wore the quiet armor that all Scorpios eventually learn to craft, I could see the fractures in it, the kind of cracks that come not from weakness, but from carrying far more than any one person should. There were three forces moving against her, and each carried a different flavor of malice. The first was a former lover who had returned under the guise of unfinished business, only to stir conflict, drain her financially, and smear her reputation in whispered corners. The second was a colleague she once trusted like family, a woman who had sat at her table and shared her wine, now spreading venomous lies through their workplace, reshaping others' perceptions of her with a precision that only envy can sharpen. The third was a blood relative, bound to her not just by shared lineage, but by a claim to her family's inheritance, who was quietly conspiring to take what was rightfully hers through deception and forged truths. When she sat before me, her energy was like a river swollen with unspoken grief. And yet, beneath that, I felt something stirring, an undercurrent not of defeat, but of something ancient preparing to rise. I laid the cards on the table, one by one, and the image that stared back at me was one I do not often see, a rare and formidable omen known in the esoteric world as La Muerte Blanca, the White Death. Do not be fooled by the name Scorpio. It is not the ending of the body, but the ending of all that poisons the spirit. It is the moment when the cosmic order moves in to dissolve the structures of harm that have been built against you, to strip away the power of those who seek to control, and to replace it with a purifying light so potent that nothing false can withstand it. The White Death is not an event you can summon with willpower alone. It arrives when the balance has tipped too far, when the scale of injustice becomes so heavy that the higher laws cannot allow it to remain. For Isolde, it meant that the clock had begun ticking for each of her three enemies, and that the universe itself had taken over the battle she had been fighting alone. The cards showed me not a gradual shift, but a collapsed three towers falling at once, a simultaneous unraveling of the very foundations these people had been standing on. And in that vision, Scorpio, I understood that what was about to happen to her could just as easily happen to you when the forces decide that enough is enough. The night she chose for the ritual was one the ancients would have marked on their calendars, a full moon heavy with light, suspended like an unblinking eye over the world. The kind of night when even the air feels charged with intent. Isale honestud. As every Scorpio does at their core, that transformation is never given freely. It demands something in return. She came prepared, not with weapons, but with symbols, 3 white candles for each of the forces working against her, a small bowl of water salted to hold purification, and a slip of paper on which she had written every wound, every betrayal, every venomous word that had been placed in her path. I instructed her to speak, not in anger but in truth. For the white death responds only to those whose hearts are stripped of vengeance. Scorpio. This is the paradox that tests you more than any other sign, the willingness to release what you could destroy. As she lit the first candle, I saw her shoulders lower, as if some invisible weight had loosened its grip. She named the first enemy without hate, acknowledging the harm but refusing to bind herself to it any longer. With the second candle, she exhaled a breath she had been holding for months, releasing the coiled tension of betrayal. And with the third, that her voice did not shake, she simply said, I return this energy to where it belongs. And in that moment, I felt the current shift, supple first, then rushing like a tide that cannot be turned back. The ritual was not elaborate, but its simplicity was its strength. When the last flame burned low, she folded the paper into the salted water, watching the ink blur and fade until the words were no longer readable. That was the final act, the surrender of proof, the erasure of her right to keep those wounds alive. She placed her palms over her heart, closed her eyes, and whispered the invocation that I had taught her, a string of words that cannot be repeated outside the circle of trust, because they are not just sound, they are a key, and when the key is turned, the lock does not simply open, it dissolves. I could feel it as surely as the pull of the moon. The mechanism had been activated somewhere in the unseen. The scales had shifted, and the process of dismantling had begun. For Isolde, the battle was no longer hers to fight. The White Death had accepted the offering, and in that acceptance, it had claimed the right to decide the outcome. She left that night with no dramatic promises, only the strange stillness that comes when a door has closed behind you forever. And Scorpio, if you have ever stood in that place, once the door shuts, nothing on the other side can follow you into what comes next. It began quietly, as most divine reckonings do, without thunder or warning, without the kind of spectacle that might make someone believe in magic at first glance. But Scorpio, you and I know true magic is not in the flash. It is in the inevitability. The first shift came with her former lover, the man who had made a sport of turning affection into a weapon, who had laced his every interaction with her in the slow poison of control. Out of nowhere, he received an offer for a job in another city. One so advantageous he could not refuse it. And with that opportunity came a sudden eagerness to resolve every lingering dispute between them. He signed the agreements, released the claims, and walked away. As if some unseen hand had pulled him from the battlefield he had sworn never to abandon. To Isolde, it felt like watching a storm dissolve mid-sky, baffling, surreal, and yet utterly final. The second fall was more precise, more surgical. The colleague who had once been welcomed into her home, who had shared laughter under soft light and then later carried that trust into the shadows, was undone by her own words. A recording surfaced, not sought by Isolde, not even known to her, in which this woman admitted, almost with pride, that she had twisted the truth out of envy. That recording made its way to the people who mattered most in the workplace, And in a matter of days, she was not only dismissed, but quietly marked as untouchable within her field. There was no confrontation, no public spectacle, only the quiet severing of ties that left her adrift, with nothing but the echo of her own malice for company. The third was the most dramatic, as if the White Death had saved its sharpest edge for last. The relative who had plotted to take what belonged to Isolde found himself caught in a net of his own weaving. Documents he had presented as proof of his claim were examined by an expert not at Isolde's request, but by a notary who felt a subtle tug of suspicion. The forgery was undeniable. What had been a civil dispute suddenly became a criminal investigation, and the weight of the law pressed down hard, stripping him not only of his claim, but of the dignity he had worn so smugly. For Isolde, the revelation was not just about justice, it was about witnessing the exact precision with which the universe can return a blow to its source. Each collapse was different in shape and sound. Yet together they formed a kind of harmony, a chord struck by unseen fingers, resonating with the truth that nothing built on deceit can stand forever. And though she had not lifted a hand to strike, each of these downfalls carried her name in their shadows, not as the cause, but as the one for whom the balance had been restored. Scorpio, when the White Death moves on your behalf, it does not ask for your rage, only your trust. And it will always deliver in its own time. What happened on the outside was extraordinary, but what began to take shape within Isolde was something even more rare, a quiet, irreversible alchemy. In the weeks after the fall of her three enemies, she found herself standing in front of a mirror and barely recognizing the woman who looked back. It was not that her face had changed, though there was a new light in her eyes that seemed to reach deeper than before, but that the energy around her had shifted so completely, she felt like she was walking in a new skin. The heaviness that had once lived in her shoulders was gone. The sharpness in her breath, that subtle flinch she had carried for months, had dissolved, and in its place was a steadiness, a groundedness that no one could take from her. She noticed herself making different choices, almost without thinking, where she once wore dark, heavy colors like a second shield. She now reached for light fabrics in shades that felt clean and alive. Where she once replayed conversations in her head, rehearsing all the things she could have said, she now allowed silence to hold the space, trusting that not every wound required her to answer. And where she once measured her days by the weight of what had been done to her, she began to measure them by the space she was creating for what could come next. Scorpio, this is the part that no one tells you. The moment the White Death does its work is not the end of your story. It is the end of the version of you who is still tied to the pain. In Isolde's case, she realized that survival had been her identity for so long that she didn't know who she was without the fight. The universe, in its ruthless compassion, had removed the fight entirely, forcing her to discover the woman she was when she was no longer defined by the harm others had tried to inflict. And in that discovery, she stepped into a kind of sovereignty that had nothing to do with control over others, and everything to do with mastery of herself. She began to speak differently, not louder, but with a resonance that made people listen without knowing why. She walked into rooms without shrinking, sensing the shift in how others responded to her presence. Her boundaries became clear without needing explanation. And the most telling sign of all was this: when she thought of the people who had once tried to break her, there was no sting left in her chest. They had become shadows in her memory, not erased, but irrelevant. For a Scorpio, whose essence is to die and be reborn many times in one lifetime, this was not just another transformation, it was the one she had been moving toward all along. And though she didn't yet know it, this inner rebirth would soon draw toward her opportunities, alliances, and love that could never have entered her life if she had remained the woman she was before. The White Death had not only cleared her path, it had cleared her soul. Scorpio, the truth revealed through Isolde's journey is one that belongs to you as much as it belongs to her, because it is written into the bones of your sign. You are the keeper of the underworld's keys. The one who can stand at the threshold between endings and beginnings without flinching. The one who understands that death, in its many forms, is never just loss, but also release. The White Death does not arrive in the lives of the careless. It comes for those who have carried more than their share of injustice. For those who have been pierced by betrayal, yet kept their hearts from hardening into stone. It is not mercy alone that calls it forth, but the deep, immovable law that all cycles must complete, that nothing can remain unbalanced forever. Isolde's experience was a mirror held up to the Scorpio spirit, a reminder that you are not here to merely survive the trials set before you, but to allow them to strip away what is false so that what is indestructible in you can stand uncovered. In her case, it was the surrender that became her power. She did not chase revenge. Though every instinct in her body would have found it easy, she did not seek to prove her worth to those who had tried to diminish her, though part of her longed to. Instead, she stepped back, trusting in a force far older and far more precise than human justice. And in doing so, she aligned herself with a current that cannot be stopped once it begins to move. This is your inheritance as a Scorpio, the ability to rise from what was meant to bury you, carrying not the weight of your scars, but the light of what those scars taught you. The White Death, when it chooses you, is not just the collapse of the structures that hurt you, it is the invitation into a higher seat of your own power. It is the moment when the venom you once carried turns to medicine, when your silence becomes sharper than any weapon, and when your very presence shifts the atmosphere around you. So if you, reading this now, feel the walls pressing in and the shadows growing closer, you know that you are not cornered. You are being prepared. The same forces that dismantled the towers in Isolde's life are capable of dismantling those in yours. All that is required is that you step into the role you were born for, the one who does not fear the dark, because you know you are the one who transforms it. The White Death is not the end. Scorpio, it is the clearing of the battlefield so you can walk into the dawn without looking back. Scorpio, if you have followed Isolde's path through every turn of this story, you already know that this is more than a narrative. It is a mirror. And it is also a summons. The White Death does not simply visit and depart. It leaves an imprint, a doorway that only you can choose to step through. Isolde did not receive her deliverance because she begged for it endlessly or because she fought harder than anyone else. She received it because she was willing to lay down the weapons she had carried for so long, to unclench her fists and stand open in the face of what she could not control. In that surrender, the laws that govern the hidden machinery of this universe aligned in her favor, dismantling everything that had been constructed against her. Now, I tell you this, the same doorway is opening for you. Perhaps you can feel it already, that strange heaviness in the air, the moments that seem to slow as if time itself is listening, the dreams that come like messages written in symbols only your soul understands. These are not coincidences. They are signals that the scales are tipping, that the balance is about to be restored in ways you cannot yet imagine. But the White Death does not work halfway. When it arrives, it asks you to let go fully of the need to control the outcome, of the desire to see your enemies punished by your own hand, of the attachment to the identity you've built around your wounds. If you can do that, the transformation will be swift and absolute. The betrayals will lose their teeth. The people who once tried to diminish you will fade into irrelevance. The energy you have been using to survive will be freed for something far greater, to create, to love, to stand in your life as the most unapologetic version of yourself. And in that space, Scorpio, you will find that the very things meant to break you have become the foundation you now stand on. So here's the threshold. Place your hand over your heart and say, not for me, but for yourself, I am ready for the balance to return. Let it be the key that opens the door. Step through and know that you do not walk alone. The same forces that wrapped their arms around Isolde when she was at her weakest are already moving toward you. They will not hesitate. They will not fail. The night is ending. And your dawn, brilliant, unshackable, and entirely yours is closer than you think.